Geoffrey Roberts, professor at University College Cork in Ireland. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So here in Russia, there are two dimensionally different takes on Stalin. Some say he was a great guy who won the Second World War, and he actually gave the country an immense boost, and others say that actually he undermined the economy, which led to the eventual collapse of the USSR. What's your take on that?
When Stalin died, Winston Churchill is reported to have said that Stalin found Russia with the wooden plough and he left it with atomic bombs. And I think that statement, sums up Stalin's achievement. And that achievement was to modernize the Soviet Union, to urbanize the Soviet Union, to industrialize the Soviet Union, to build the foundations of a country that was able to withstand the German invasion in 1941 and go on to win a victory over fascism. And also the foundations for the post-war rise of the Soviet Union to a nuclear superpower. If Russia is still a great country today, with an important role to play in the world, an enormous potential for the future, it's because of the foundations that were laid during Stalin's time. Now, having said that, of course, there can be lots of questions and discussions as to whether or not this modernization of Russia had to have been as brutal as it was, because of course Stalin might have modernized Russia and the Soviet Union, but you
mean the post-war Russia?
No, the pre-war Russia as well, but Stalin was also responsible for the deaths of millions of people. So you can have a discussion about the cost, you can have a discussion about alternatives, about whether or not different courses of action and events would have been perhaps more effective than the ones that Stalin pursued. But nevertheless, in the end, it's a historical fact that the Soviet Union was successfully modernized under Stalin, albeit on a very brutal basis.
So the cause of the collapse really is to blame on other leaders that came after Stalin rather than...
Well, of course, that's the other point to make, of course, is that the system that Stalin built and which persisted after his death. Okay, when he died, a lot of some of the more brutal aspects of the system disappeared, such as the mass terror. But essentially, it was still Stalin's system. But that system was a very defective system in many ways, and it was those defects that, in the end, result in the collapse.
But also the mentality, that Stalin sort of tried to establish in the Soviet Union, and the mentality that he left after his death was also to blame for the collapse at the end of the day, no?
Well, it depends what kind of mentality you're talking about. Stalin was a communist. He believed in socialism. He believed in a communist utopia. He believed in the Soviet system. He believed that the Soviet Union was a model for the whole world. Now, one doesn't have to agree with his beliefs or that vision, but one has to recognize the power of that vision. And the power of that vision was very, very important in the historical development of the Soviet Union, both while Stalin was alive and then subsequently. Of course, what happens is Gorbachev comes along and he questions and challenges that traditional Soviet self-image and attempts to reform the system in quite a radical way. And then the result of that, of course, is the eventual collapse of the system.
Talking about Stalin as a political figure, I guess people in the West mostly know him as the man who led Russia to win the Second World War. See, here for us at home, there is no doubt that we won the war, and without Russia, Second World War would not have been won. Yes. Are there doubts in the West about that? And how is there a genuine interest actually in the West to really find out about the role of Russia and how it really led the war to be won?
There are some people in the West who would want to deny not just Russia, but the Soviet Union's role in winning the Second World War. Well, because it's an uncomfortable truth for them to face up to, that this authoritarian socialist communist regime under this dictator Stalin was responsible for the defeat of Hitler, and in effect was responsible for...
As opposed to Nazis?
Well, those kind of people also tend to have the view that there was no great difference between Nazism and communism, and that Stalin and Hitler were just as bad as each other. But I don't think that would be the most prevalent view. I think the most prevalent view will be one that would recognize the differences between Nazism and communism, and the differences between Hitler and Stalin, and that Hitler was a far more dangerous dictator for the world than Stalin ever was. So I think there is nowadays increasing recognition of the Soviet role in winning the war, although of course there are always people who want to present a different view, present a distorted view of the events of the Second World War.
So you're someone who knows a lot about it and who studied Stalin. You wouldn't say that at this point in the West there is a deficit of knowledge about Stalin and his role and Russia's role in World War II.
There's always a deficit of historical knowledge. There's a deficit of knowledge about the world, but not just in the West, also in Russia as well. So, but I think, I don't think that deficit is too great at the moment. As I said, I think there is nowadays much greater recognition of the Soviet role in the Second World War. More recognition than people in Russia actually recognise, because what you're saying to me is something the Russians are always saying to me. Why don't they recognise our role in winning the Second World War? And I always say to them, well, actually most people do, particularly since the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War there was this ideological struggle going on, of course, and part of that ideological battle was an effort by Western Cold Warriors to deny the reality of the Soviet role in defeating Nazi Germany. And there are Western Cold Warriors still exist, and they're still making the same kind of arguments, but they're not as widespread and effective as they used to be.
So now you'd think that people from that war are still alive and the memories of that war are still so fresh. You'd think that would learn our lesson, but then you see this huge nationalist right movement rising up in Europe. What's to blame? Well,
that's not the extreme right movement in Europe. Ultranationalism and nationalism in general is not a new phenomenon. It's not a recent phenomenon. Now, it's true that recently the political influence of nationalism in its various forms, particularly the more extreme forms, has grown in various countries of Europe. I think that has mostly to do with the economic and political problems that Europe is facing at the moment, which pose a dire threat to the whole future of the European Union. I think it is also partly to do with the fact that as time goes on, the war recedes from memory, becomes a much more distant event, and the more time elapses, the more possibilities there are for people to present distorted accounts of the war. So I think it is partly a function of the distance we've actually travelled from the war that partly explains this development of nationalism, ultra-nationalism, extreme nationalism in Europe. I don't think it's the main reason. The main reason I think is to do with contemporary politics and economics rather than history. Now, and that's not to say that history isn't important, of course, because there are many lessons of history which are relevant to the contemporary crisis.
So you believe if the worst crisis that Europe right now is experiencing, if that is to last or get worse, that will also incite the rise of more nationalist sentiment?
I think there is a great danger of that. If the Eurozone collapses, if the EU collapses, the most likely scenario is that it will be replaced by different forms of nationalism. The question is what forms of nationalism and how extreme and dangerous they're going to be. So I think there are great dangers. And of course that's the historical lesson of what happened before the Second World War, particularly in the 1930s, where you had a similar crisis to the one we're going through now, and the result of that was the rise of nationalism, extreme nationalism in Europe, and the emergence of a number of authoritarian and indeed fascist and Nazi type regimes. So that's the historical lesson there is that there is a great danger of that development. Now, I don't see it as by any means being inevitable. I think the difference between now and then is that democratic culture, democratic institutions are much stronger in Europe than they were before the Second World War. So I wouldn't say I'm confident, but I'm hopeful that European democracy can survive this current crisis.
Do you think, talking of democratic institutes, do you think that a politician with anti-democratic views could rise to power through those democratic institutes.
Well, that's exactly what happened in the case of Hitler, didn't it? And that's what happened in a number of other countries in Europe, both before and after the Second World War. So it's a distinct possibility, and it will be a challenge. It will be a test of Western democracy, not just Western democracy, but European and international democracy. Can it actually survive the challenge of that kind of nationalism, which can, of course, thrive in conditions of economic collapse and political disorder?
Could sticking together as a united Europe maybe work as a magic potion against rise of nationalism?
I don't think it's a panacea, but I sincerely hope that the European Union doesn't collapse, because for all its faults, the European Union and what it represents is much, much better than the ultra-nationalist alternative. Who knows what's going to happen? I think it's possible the European Union will survive, and I hope it does survive. And if I were Russians, I would actually be hoping that's the case as well, because the collapse of the EU and the rise of extreme forms of nationalism in Europe could pose quite a significant challenge for Russia.
Professor Geoffrey Roberts, thank you very much for this interview.